For the next 10 minutes, we're going to talk about one of the absolute coolest feasts of the Old Testament and how Jesus actually fulfills this feast in the New Testament. This is a really cool part of the Old Testament, so stay tuned until the end when I talk about what this means for Christians today. Let's get into it. The Passover is a feast of Israel introduced in Exodus 12. This feast was originally a day of great anticipation in Israel as they awaited their immediate deliverance from their bondage in Egypt. Through performing the Passover feast, future generations of Israelites were able to relive God's deliverance of them from bondage. The Passover feast is then included in a list of feasts in Leviticus 23, noted in verses 4 and 5. The Passover has significant thematic and theological power throughout all of the first 5 books of the Bible, as well as the Old and New Testaments as a whole. These significances will be explored throughout this video. First, let's take a look at the historical setting. Feasts were special times in Israel, as they were to remember God's faithfulness and rest in His goodness. Feasts were to be observed yearly and were commanded, not optional. This is included in Leviticus as a part of feasts including the Sabbath, Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and others. It was to be observed on the 14th of the first month of the religious calendar each year, which was the same day as the first Passover in Egypt. The Passover was instituted in Exodus 12 during the last plague on Egypt. Israel was a slave people group under the harsh control of the Pharaoh. They yearned for deliverance from their God. Through Moses, Aaron, and a series of plagues, God pushed the tyrannical rulership away. However, when the Pharaoh would not let Israel go out to worship, God set to kill all the firstborn in Egypt. A provision was made, however, that if anyone were to take part in the Passover, whether a natural Israelite or Egyptian convert, the angel of death would pass over their house and spare their firstborn. This yearly remembrance of the Passover by the Israelites would cause them to remember the character of God permeating their deliverance. Additionally, the use of a lamb for the sacrifice furthered the biblical theme of God's giving a lamb for the sacrifice of Jesus. This theme will be touched on in the personal application. Now let's take a look at God's character through the Passover. God's character in the Passover is clear. He is merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth, keeping mercy for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but by no means clearing the guilty, visiting iniquity of the fathers upon the children and the children's children to the 3rd and 4th generations. God's compassion and justice are clearly seen here. His patience is clear and beyond doubt. God demonstrates His power over Egypt for 9 plagues, giving any unbelieving Egyptian the ability to trust in His power. Only after undeniably showing His strength and domain, He announces the final plague to Egypt through Moses. Thus says the Lord, "About midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in Egypt shall die." All of Egypt and Israel knew what was going to come. They had seen the previous plagues, and if they had any softness in their heart, they'd be able to seek God and follow the Passover requirements, which essentially was just blood on the doorposts. God was merciful and spared all those who desired to know Him, yet punished all the wicked who rejected Him. When the Israelites left Egypt, many of those who were not naturally born Israelites were able to leave with them. This happens even though they would become a stumbling block later. Through the Passover, God's mercy, justice, and strength were all demonstrated to Israel. However, there's one more attribute of God strongly present in the text. Throughout the Bible, God's power is made known to Israel. However, through those demonstrations, pagan nations are given the ability to see and know the God of Israel. The Passover left Egypt without any excuse, for all people who were there were able to know the God of Israel. However, it wasn't just Egypt. The effects were widespread throughout the ancient Near East, reaching as far as to the Philistines hundreds of years later. In 1 Samuel, the priests and diviners of Philistia speak to their local lords, saying, "Why then do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaohs hardened their hearts? When He did mighty things among them, did they not let the people go, that they might depart?" God had plans bigger than even the Egyptians and the Israelites. Through demonstrating His mighty hand, God witnessed to all the nations surrounding Israel. This incredible mercy and sovereignty of God is present throughout the entire Old Testament and culminates in the New Testament writings. Those will be discussed next in the personal application. Now, there are 2 main personal applications that can be taken from this text. The first and more obvious is the typological significance of the Passover lamb. The New Testament writers see Jesus as the antitype of the ancient Jewish practice of the Passover, seen in passages such as Revelation 5:6, which says, "A lamb as though it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes," and that's talking about Jesus. Jesus is the Passover lamb who causes the wrath of God, seen in the angel of death, to pass over people. Second, after meditating on the reactions by the Egyptians and the Philistines as noted above, I believe there's a clear apologetic significance present in this feast. Many of the Egyptians saw the wonders of God and feared him, leaving with the Israelites from Egypt. Presumably, even some of the Philistines from the plague of 1 Samuel 6 learned to fear God. However, seemingly, the vast majority did not. They saw with their own eyes the power of God and his protection of Israel, yet continued to reject him. It's as if they wanted to reject him. This brings to mind Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus. In Luke 16:31, Jesus says, "They do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded though one rise from the dead." I personally very much enjoy natural and philosophical apologetics. However, arguments for the existence of God from nature and philosophy may only serve to confirm something the hearer already knows in their heart, namely that God exists. The problem may not be intellectual, but emotional and moral, as any good explanation of the problem of evil will attest. People do not want to know God because they don't want to be held accountable by him. This disposition must shape the way apologetics and evangelism are approached if we as Christians are to gain any footing in someone's spiritual life. Now let's cover 4 special issue questions. Number 1, are the feasts only important as they are fulfilled as symbols in Jesus? The feasts are only important in Jesus inasmuch as the actual Passover is only important in observing the feast. I do not believe the feasts are required to be observed. However, reflection on the character of God in them, as done above, has shown to be incredibly edifying. God does not change, so the entire Old Testament reveals his immutable character and love, including the feasts. Number 2, is celebrating the feasts a part of legalism? Legalism is the practice of law for the law's sake. Practicing feasts for the purpose of loving God and edifying yourself or others is an honorable thing and should not be discouraged. I can attest to this, as the 2 Passover Seders I've attended have been a unique time to remember God's goodness with others and to worship God. Number 3, is the Sabbath relevant in the conversation of feasts? The Sabbath seems to follow the same thematic center as other feasts, which includes the remembrance of God's actions and resting. Meditation on God is a core idea of the Sabbath, shared with the feasts. So, yes, it is relevant in the conversation about feasts. And lastly, number 4, are the feasts only for Israel? The feasts are only for Israel inasmuch as the foundation of a house is only for the builder. Every person who lives in the house must walk on the foundation. The Old Testament laws are not for the New Testament believer, but they are very profitable for learning. And number 5, the most important question to ask: what are you going to do with this information? Are you going to go out and serve God with it, or are you going to sit and do nothing? Now, have you ever wondered what the sin offering of the Old Testament was, and how Jesus actually fulfills the sin offering? If so, click on this video right here. Or have you ever wondered how the New Testament compares Jesus to the Old Testament? Click on this video right here. Please give me feedback in the comments or a video idea you'd like to see. I work full-time and attend seminary full-time, so any feedback would be incredibly encouraging. May the Lord bless you and keep you.